So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this GLOBSEC City Talk on propaganda, the age of propaganda, and the question of whether we are ready. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists and myself. Despite the fact that the lights have gone down and I can see almost nothing, I'd like to start off by getting you to introduce yourselves briefly. If we can just have a very quick show of hands. How many diplomats do we have here? Do we have diplomatic staff anywhere? A few? Students? Many students? Jolly good. We're all learning. Journalists? Few and far between, but twice as valuable nonetheless. Interested citizens? People who are interested at all? Very good. Okay. So to introduce ourselves, I will be your host for this evening. I'll show you where the emergency exits are and what to do when the oxygen comes down. On my right is Minister Falah Mustafa Bakir, who is the minister from the Foreign Ministry of Kurdistan in Iraq. On my left is Yevhen Fedchenko, who is the founder of the website stopfake.org. Now, the minister is largely dealing at the moment with the information war coming from ISIS and all the implications that had for the Middle East. Yevhen clearly is dealing with the information war coming from Russia. My name's Nimmo. I'm a former journalist in the Baltic states and Brussels. After that, I became a NATO press officer and for 4 years was the NATO press officer responsible for Ukraine and Russia. So you could say that everything which is happening there is all my fault. So I do apologize. But therefore, I've been on the receiving end of information warfare for a long time as well. So we'll be talking about information warfare. We'll be talking about propaganda. As much as possible, we're going to keep this an open session. So I would greatly prefer it if we don't solely focus on Russia. We don't solely focus on Ukraine. We don't solely focus on ISIS. We focus on the techniques and concepts of practices of information warfare. And we have 2 experts in the field here. So please bear that in mind as the context in which we're working. Yeah, we have 2 guests. Let's make the most of both of them. In terms of the rules of the game, we have 1 hour. So we will dispense with opening statements. Apart from mine, I'm the moderator, so I'm allowed to, but nobody else is. So we won't have opening statements. We will go straight to questions and answers. Please keep your questions short. We want a dialogue here, not a monologue. So if I feel that the question is going on too long, I will raise my hand and ask you to come to the actual question mark. In the same way, I will try and balance the time between our speakers so that neither feels like they can fall asleep and get away with it, which is always a danger on a panel. And when you give the question, please very briefly identify who you are and what your field is, whether you're a diplomat or a journalist or a real human being, whichever works. As the moderator, I will ask the first question, which is my privilege. And this is my question to both panelists, and the question is very simple. You're both fighting an information war, so who's winning and why? And if we can start with the minister.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I come from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I can say that I'm coming from a front line, therefore my presentation would not be analysis, it would be the day-to-day business that we are fighting against the most brutal terrorist organization. Indeed, ISIS does have a strategy, and their strategy has been a strategy of fear, using the media, the social media, Twitter, Facebook, every means at their disposal in order to propagate against everybody else. Because they have got the rule of the thumb, which is that anybody who disagrees with them is against them and their enemy, and they have the right to behead them and to kill them. Therefore, it is a combination of religious extremism and national chauvinism. Therefore, they have been able to use that strategy of fear to frighten people, to frighten everybody. And unfortunately, we have all helped them in letting them, because when people want to cross borders, there are policemen who would check. But with the social media, there is no boundary. They have been able to use that, the social media, the Facebook, the Twitter, and other possible means to recruit people, to propagate, and also to make sure that they get support from around the world. Therefore, the point is that they are losing on the battlefront. We, the Peshmerga forces of Kurdistan, have been brave enough to stop their advances at the beginning, to be on the defensive, then to be on the offensive and push them back. We have killed a large number of them. According to our estimate, 11,000 have been killed in the front lines with Kurdistan region by the Peshmergas and also the airstrikes from the coalition partners. But we have also given sacrifices. It has been a costly war. 1,200 Peshmergas have been martyred and 7,000 have been wounded. To sustain this war is not enough. Therefore, militarily, we are winning the war. But whether we have a strategy collectively to fight their propaganda, I don't believe we are yet there. We have a responsibility in the region, I mean, in Kurdistan and Iraq, regionally, the regional powers, as well as the international community. So therefore, we have to be ready to counter message, to tell them who do they represent. In our belief, they represent the minority of people who believe in this style, in this violence. But what about the rest of the majority of Muslims or Islamic world? If they agree on that, no. Everybody says they disagree. Then they have to come up with a counter message to make sure that people get the right message. Therefore, we have to work together collectively. It's not only the responsibility of the Kurds in Kurdistan or the Iraqis in Iraq, it's the responsibility of all the Islamic countries, the Arab countries, in order to confront them and show their face. Because wherever they are, there is no meaning of life. Therefore, it is about religious extremism, about national chauvinism, and not accepting the other side.
Minister, thank you. We'll hold that there for a second. We'll turn to Yevhen. Yep. So a different field of conflict, but the same information concepts involved. So you're involved in an information war. Who's winning?
Yeah. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. To be short, I would say we are winning. But by saying we, I do not mean Ukraine. When I'm saying we, I mean the Western liberal civilization, because the information war happening now is not about Ukraine. It's just happening, first of all, in Ukraine. And this is just a part of a bigger information warfare, which is happening globally. And even despite of the fact if some countries or some people would recognize it or not, would agree with that or not, they are subjected to this influence, and they can feel the impact in places which are very far away from Ukraine. And actually, I can argue that the biggest damage from propaganda towards Ukraine was already done much before the military warfare itself began. So it was a preparation for military warfare. And now this spread to the world, and if you would start carefully reading Russian media outlets, even though when I'm telling media, probably I would use it as a euphemism for propaganda machine, you might notice that there are not one propaganda over there. There are 3 different propagandas. One is for Russia itself, and probably it's the most dangerous. Another one would be for Ukraine, and the rest would be targeting the global audience. And again, the aim of this very propaganda is not to deliver alternative set of values which propaganda usually do, as saying you should believe me because I'm standing for and that and that. But Russian propaganda, or I would rather call it Kremlin propaganda just to avoid generalization, Kremlin propaganda is aiming to frustrate people, to make them disbelieve in core values which they already have. They want to people to disbelieve in core values of the liberal civilization, like free election, free media, democracy in general. So when you would be reading to what Russia Today or Sputnik or whoever is publishing, you would not, almost not notice that they are praising the Russian way of living or Russian way of doing things. They would try to persuade you that you should distrust your government, your values, and this is completely different what we had in the time of the Cold War, when Soviet system was persuading people to subscribe to socialism or communism or whatever leftist set of ideas you might want to believe in. So this is completely different. And that's why I would argue that we are winning because we've been successful in a couple of things. We've been successful in raising public awareness globally about existence of propaganda. And this is one of the biggest achievements because what we do at Stop Fake, we do not want to debunk any piece of information Russian propaganda is producing, because believe me, the scale of production, of manufacturing cycle of Russian propaganda is enormous, and nobody can beat that. No Ukraine, no Stop Fake, no European Union, no any government in the world, because Russian government been investing into that for many, many years. And I might say that the construction of this machine started back in 2005, just after Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And they devoted a lot of resources and time. And you can just not beat that like that. So what we would rather do, we would try to get all that information in one place for the sake of chronicling it, and to show the people that there is a system behind it, and to show that you can find a system and the whole infrastructure and and you can find the perfect logic behind that. And that's what we want to do with that. And we see the raise of awareness, this is the most important. And the second issue, we've been successful in debunking one of the major issues here, to demonstrate that this is not a civil war in Ukraine, but rather this is a war of Russia against Ukraine, and establish that fact on the ground.
Very good. Thank you, Yevhen. That was my question. Do we have questions from the floor at this point? Questions for either expert on information warfare? I see we have a brave gentleman here. I partially see we have a brave gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Martin Ogrozdin. I'm a human being, or a research fellow.
Congratulations.
To be more concrete. My question is both for the panelists, and it is that propaganda doesn't exist only on the ISIS side or the Russian side. We also have Radio Free Europe. We have Euronews. We have Deutsche Welle and other news channels. We don't consider them propaganda, but they can be perceived as such. Why are these instruments are not so successful and effective as the ones like the ISIS or the Russian government, or let's call them the chiefs of the Kremlin have?
Well,
very good question.
In fact, it's a problem for governments, because usually people don't try to believe in the governments. Therefore, this is the role of the free media, this is the role of the civil society institutions, in order to play that role, to show the people the reality. First, we have to agree on the proper definition for terrorism. What do you mean by terrorism? Who is a terrorist? Second, we have to revisit the laws that allow these terrorists to benefit. The free and democratic societies in the West and the rest, or in the West, the United States, Australia, whatever, we have no problem with people who live in our part of the world, who are from Islamic background, from poor countries, who have joined terrorism. But what about those who have been living and educated in free and democratic societies? Something is wrong. Yes, when we talk about the origin or the roots, we talk about the governance, as Prime Minister Cameron mentioned it, the corruption, mismanagement, abuse, etc. But what about the rest? Therefore, there is something wrong, that we have to revisit the laws in order to tackle this issue properly. Then it's not a proper definition when people call them jihadists. Jihad is a holy war. Do we believe that these people are fighting the holy war? Against whom? Against other human beings? Therefore, the problem is that if people don't trust the government information, then they are subject to the misinformation of ISIS and the like. So therefore, I believe it's a collective responsibility for us to have a proper definition of terrorism, to have legal procedures in order to ensure that hate speech would be considered as an attempt at terrorism. Therefore, we have to make sure that we put an end of such kind of thing, because we are paying a price, because such kind of misinformation and the propaganda pave the way for more and more recruitment for young boys and girls to go and join ISIS, some for sexual affairs and some for just failed people in the society go there and become killers. Therefore, they are killers, they are brutal people, they don't represent Islam, and they are not jihadists. Therefore, we need the media, we need the civil society, and we need legal aspects in order to tackle this issue.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah.
Yevhen?
Yeah, my answer would be I am blessed not to belong to the government, so I don't need to justify my credibility because I came from journalism and I am a head of journalism school and I am the person which should stand behind the standards of journalism. So what we are doing, Ukraine doesn't need another propaganda because for us in Ukraine, the situation seems to be pretty black and white. There is aggression against Ukraine. Ukraine is on self-defense. So this is a line, and we don't need to invent facts on the ground to prove that. And the more the other side invests in time and money into discredits Ukraine and Ukraine's cause, the more obvious it becomes that probably it's something wrong on that side of the communication chain. So what we do, we just debunk the story if we find them fake or false, if you wish. And so we really don't need another propaganda. And that's what I'm arguing about, that Ukrainian government should not be and is not involved in propaganda efforts because what we do is absolutely right course, and the truth by the end of the day would prevail. On the other hand, we should really look into one very interesting phenomena, because if you followed the Russian narrative of Ukrainian events, it was constructed in a way to put Ukraine on a permanent course of defense. So Ukrainians should defend themselves all the time, what we are not. So as we do the revolution, we are accused to have a coup d'etat. If we want a better government, we are accused to be a kind of fascists. If we want to have a freer society, we're accused in being, oppressors and on other things. So it's really very interesting that Ukraine should defend itself all the time. And it's a very paradoxical thing. And it's absolutely a mesmerizing course because, again, we should probably change this narrative to make it more just, because Ukraine is struggling for self-defense and in more general way is struggling to defend the universal European values, and why Ukraine should defend its right to struggle for that. Also, you mentioned Western media organizations. I don't see why we can perceive them as being a part of our propaganda machine. They are just delivering information, and they do not manipulate this information, and they tell news. And again, there is a huge space here for manipulation of the whole discourse, because when we see Russian propaganda outlets come into this discourse, they pretend to be the second point of view, and within this pluralistic discourse, they have the right to be heard. Probably yes, but people should come with a clear understanding that they are not second point of view, because the second point of view should be based on objective information and facts, even opinions, but they should not be manipulated. So just to give you one example of what is happening, we have here director of Kiev Institute of Sociology, who today published the results of the poll in Ukraine about the prospects of joining EU and NATO. And on the same day, but 2 hours later, Russians are giving their poll on Ukraine, and somehow it's completely different to what Kiev Institute of Sociology did. And they have very different system of measurements, and they have the whole concept manipulated in a way to show that Ukrainians are completely disappointed in the Western reception of Ukraine, so the numbers of EU and NATO kind of supporters is rapidly declining. And we have just another poll which shows completely different. Yes, there is probably a small sliding down, but small. It's not like, oh, the country is terribly disappointed, so they are really welcoming any kind of alternative way of development because just the West waved Ukraine off.
If I just add on this, in having the counter narrative or messaging for ISIS and their conduct is easy, doable, is not impossible. For example, their belief in beheading people, in burning human beings, I don't believe anybody would accept that. Second, they are against the past, against now, against the future. With their attack in destroying the national heritage, the cultural sites, these are all things. Therefore, we have to have a short-term and long-term policy. I believe education is key in our hand to ensure peaceful coexistence among communities and accepting each other. Second, the curriculum of schools and Islamic schools have to be revisited so that we will generate generations who believe in peaceful coexistence and tolerance.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, do we have any questions from upstairs? There's an arm back up right at the top there, yep. A voice from on high.
Hello, I would like to ask you, Mr. Minister, who do you think should lead a coalition against ISIS in a way that the enemy...
Sorry, can you introduce yourself, please?
I'm a student of international relations in Maastricht University. And also, who should lead the coalition against ISIL in the way that it would be difficult for enemies to use information against them? For example, if it was America, they could say that this is an American plot to destabilize Middle East and so on. So who do you think should be the leader? So to avoid these types of things. Thank you.
Well, talking about the reasons behind the emergence of ISIS, if I talk about Iraq, we have Syria as well. So in Iraq, the wrong policies of the former Prime Minister Maliki paved the way for this, because with the exclusion of the Sunnis, with the marginalization of the Sunnis, with alienating them, they did not feel that they were partners in the country. So therefore, the western part of Iraq became kind of a safe haven for these terrorists, and therefore when the ISIS came, there were a small number of ISIS who wanted to release prisoners in Badouj and pose a threat to Mosul, but contrary to their expectation, the whole Iraqi army in the western part of the country collapsed. But the problem is, this is an Iraqi war. This is the people in Kurdistan, people in Iraq. We are in the front lines. We have to fight them. It's our responsibility. But we do need the support of the international community in terms of training, weapons, arms, and etc. We in Kurdistan did not ask for troops on the ground. We said we believe in our Peshmergas, and the Peshmergas have done a great job in protecting the people of Kurdistan. Not only that, we are hosting today 1.8 million refugees or IDPs from the rest of Iraq and refugees from Syria. But internationally, we need the support of the international community. But unfortunately, there have been a number of anti-ISIL or anti-ISIS conferences. We have not been invited as KRG. Although the Peshmergas are in a front line which is 1,050 kilometers long, we have defeated ISIS, and yet our voice is not there. The Iraqi federal government goes there and rejecting Kurdistan regional government to be represented. Therefore, we are fighting them on the front line, yet we are not considered as a partner, and there is no respect and appreciation for the role that we are doing. Second, stopping the logistic support that they have, stopping the financial support that gets to them, and also giving them the free hand to move around. This is the role of the regional powers as well as the international community. Therefore, I believe there is room for that to be done. If there is will, there is way. We can do it collectively, because this is a threat to all of us. Because there are people from 90 nationalities who are fighting within ISIS. Imagine when these people go back to the countries that they have come from. They have got networks. No country would be immune if they think it. Therefore, it's the responsibility of Kurdistan regional government, the government of Iraq, the regional powers, and the international community.
If I may actually just follow up on that question, because it brings up an interesting point, which is the perception of the West and the Americans. Something that I saw while at NATO was a perception in the Russian media that as soon as NATO was mentioned, all the Russian media would go, it's a NATO plot.
Yeah.
And that in terms of the propaganda, as soon as NATO was mentioned, you would trigger an avalanche both of social media trolling and of official comments, up to the level of foreign minister. So purely in terms of the propaganda, there was a very fine balance. There was an awareness which we had to keep in mind at all the time, that there are certain subjects such as NATO or the US which in the Russian public perception are automatically the bad guys. So I'd like to ask both of our panelists, to what extent in terms of information do you have to be careful with Western sources, US sources, American support, NATO support? To what extent can you present that, and to what extent is there a perception that the support of NATO or the US is in itself a handicap?
Yeah, absolutely.
Should we start with Yevhen?
Yeah, I would agree with that, because if you would go to our website, and we would have more than 500 stories, so probably most of them would be anti-Western in general, and some of them would be anti-NATO, in a way that Russian propaganda was saying that this is a war between local militia and NATO since the early days of the war in the eastern Ukraine. And sometimes it was put in a most ridiculous way you can find, because once we had an article which was explaining that the local militia spotted, and now attention, Afro-Americans in military fatigue who've been talking between themselves in Polish. So can you imagine? I mean, for most people here in this audience, it would sound really ridiculous. But believe me, there is an audience for every piece of information you produce. So if you don't have quite critical level of perception of you are told, you might fall to be a victim. But if you are bombarded that from morning till evening, and if you consume your news diet mostly from television, and I must say that according to Levada polls, 94% of Russians get their daily news exclusively from television. 94%. So now imagine yourself sitting between television, TV set, and refrigerator, as one of Russian journalists make jokes that this is a war between TV set and refrigerator. So the less you have in your refrigerator, the more time you spend in front of your TV set. And if you are bombarding from morning till evening that in Ukraine, NATO is employing Polish-speaking Afro-Americans, believe me, by the end of the day, probably not the first, but the second or third, you would totally share that point of view, and probably some of people who witness that would go and sign up to be in so-called local militia over there. So that's how it works. That's the mechanics of this. So that's really very important to understand that, I mean, with propaganda, it doesn't work like you can have very high degree of critical perception. But if you've been subjected to that for a very long time, you start to perceive it more and more in a way it is a reality. And then when you go to the street and you talk to your colleagues, to your friends, and you immerse yourself in social media, and you see pretty much the same pieces of information, you finally start to believe that, yeah, probably if everybody else believes in that, I should also subscribe to that point of view.
Thank you, Yevhen.
No, in our case, it's different, because when we have the Peshmergas fighting them, when people realized and saw the brutality and beheading of people, destroying places, everybody was supportive of the Peshmerga. But the Peshmerga have the will to fight. Mm-hmm. And that's why they are in the front line, and they have not been paid since April. As a result of the differences that we have between Erbil and Baghdad, that we do not get our fair share from the budget, we have not been able to pay their salaries. Just imagine if it were not for the love of their country, to believe in what they do, they would leave their battlefront. And we have other cases that people lay down their arms, leave the ground, and ISIS is winning. Therefore, The people of Kurdistan are all supportive of the Peshmerga, what they do. Having said that, we are grateful for the coalition led by the United States. If it were not for the timely intervention of the United States with the airstrikes, we would have been in a very difficult situation. Therefore, early August, when they attacked us heavily, the American intervention helped a great deal the Peshmerga to be able to stop the advances of ISIS and to be. Therefore, we don't need a propaganda in this case. People see the reality. People are supportive because who are the Peshmerga? The Peshmerga are the sons and daughters of our own community. Therefore, people are supportive. People are behind the Peshmergas. We had many veterans and many volunteers who went to the front line to be supportive of the Peshmerga. But we made it clear that we need weapons, we need ammunition, and we need resources to sustain this war. Therefore, I believe we can do it because our mission is clear. We are fighting for humanity. We are fighting for values. We're fighting for women's rights, for human rights. ISIS does not stand for any of these values because they are against life, they are against men and women, they are against equality and justice.
Thank you, Minister. Now, I saw we had a question up at the back here, if that question is still going. Yep. A microphone would be grand, yeah, if we can get right up to the back there.
Thank you. I'm a political scientist and I'm from Bratislava, from here. I would like to ask Mr. Bakir, since he's a Kurdish official, what is the point of view or what is the perspective of majority Turkish media, since Turkey is a very important neighbor of Iraq and also Syria in this conflict? Turkey sometimes plays positive role, sometimes not so positive, but what is the perception of Turkish media of nowadays Kurdistan and Kurdish people?
Well, I think it's a good question to be asked directly to the Turkish media and to the Turkish public. But as a matter of fact, Kurdistan region believes in having good neighborly relations with all the neighbors, with Turkey, with Iran, and also to have an understanding. Yes, we as Kurds have been divided against our will. The majority of the Kurdish population lives in Turkey, then in Iran, third largest is Iraq, and then in Syria. We were divided against our will, and we have become part of 4 countries. Since 1991, there has been a turn of history where Kurdistan region was able to free itself from Saddam Hussein regime. And we went to elections, we elected our parliament, we formed our government, and we established our institutions. Yes, we were part of Iraq, but we were not under the control of Saddam Hussein. Therefore, when in 2003, the US-led coalition came to depose Saddam Hussein and overthrow the regime, Kurdistan region was liberated. We helped liberate the Northern Front. It was difficult for Turkey to digest that at the time. They were dealing with the situation on day-to-day basis, waiting for the day that the regime in Baghdad would come back to control the situation, because we have a long border to share with Turkey, and the Kurdistan regional government was at the border. After 2003, we had difficulties, because Turkey did not recognize the change that Kurdistan region would be there. They avoided talking to us, they avoided any relationship. But in 2008, while they had 100,000 Turkish troops on the border, we still said that we want to live in peace, we want partnership, we want to have good relations. May that year, there was the first meeting between both sides, and that ended up in opening the Turkish Consulate General in Erbil. Therefore, we have official talks, we have commercial activities, and we have energy cooperation. We have seen ups and downs in these relations, but we are committed to this. I believe the public and the media in Turkey have seen changes, and changes which are in the interest of stability, security, and the well-being of both sides. And there is much that we can learn and we can benefit from each other.
Thank you, Minister. I saw we had 2 questions down the front. There was the gentleman and the lady. So if we take both questions now, and then we can deal with them together.
Yeah, my question goes to Yevhen Fedchenko. You indicated that
already.
Sorry,
can you introduce yourself?
Andreas Umland from the Kiev Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation. You indicated already the problem in the last statements you made, that the Russian propaganda may not be successful in the West, but it is very successful in Russia. And we also see in the polls that Russians tend to think about world affairs more and more in terms of conspiracy theories, paranoia, even surrealism, one could argue, a sort of Manichaean worldview. And I mean, it's first of all a problem for Ukraine, but also, I guess, for the world, that the second most heavily armed people in the world that is now in an economic decline lives in an alternative reality, you could argue, you know, where they really think that the US conspiracy using Ukrainian fascists is after them, and if they don't, you know, defend them as they see it, then so what can one do about that? That's the question. I mean, about the Russian audience, not so much about the Western audience.
And the lady 3 seats along, in the other direction, along. There we go, lovely.
Thank you. My name is Natalia Gumenyuk. I'm a Ukrainian journalist from Hromadske TV. So we as a journalists often push to answer for the propaganda, what is our answer, but what we see from this discourse, that especially in the Kremlin, we do have the very coordinated attack with the government, with the diplomacy, public diplomacy, military, security, economy. And what is our way, and is it their awareness how we can answer? And I hate as a journalist, that the government would be interacting in some public sphere and be doing something in the media, but what would be this, not just a response, but who are there to answer, that it's not just media against another media, and how we get out of this really unequal equality when the media are kind of compared to some different machine, when, for instance, the quote and some talk, like some press release from NATO could be considered as an equal threat from the real military action. How are we getting out of this situation, and who can be also included?
I guess that both questions are for Yevhen, yeah? Sorry, Minister.
Yeah, the great question about parallel reality. So it took time to construct it, as I mentioned, and there is no quick solution to take huge country out of that. First of all, because government would not give up on that, because it's the worse economic situation becomes, the more they need to persuade people that there is an enemy beyond the borders, and that can be Ukrainians, that can be the West in general. And again, so if we would go back to polls, Levada polls are probably the still only pollster which is reputable. They recently asked a question, whom can be considered by Russians the main reason to the war in Ukraine? And 80% answered that this is the Western governments and Ukrainian government as a kind of a puppet government which is puppeteered by the West, mainly, of course, Washington, D.C. 80% blame the West in what happened in Ukraine. And I'm surprised not with a figure, because we can question that. If people are not free to express their feelings, probably we can doubt that. But I am more impressed that this is exactly the same figure which used to be 1 year ago. And this is due to intensive propaganda warfare, which keep this feeling, anti-Western feeling up. And even if you today would go to Twitter and look, because we had a concurrent event with this one, Economic Forum in Petersburg, you can find there all types of nonsenses, how West is blamed for what is happening, for everything, for Ukrainian war, for Ukrainian coup d'etat, for one very simple reason, because Putin cannot live with the idea that people somewhere in other country can voluntarily go to the street to stand up against the government, and if government is not accountable, to change this government through election for another government and another president. So this is a complete denial of very principle of the change of the government. And this is feelings which are shared by most Russian journalists from mainstream so-called media again, and they persuade their audiences in that. So what can be done about that? Information, and another information. So you cannot beat this propaganda with another counter-propaganda, because this propaganda is enforced by social media, and after the fake news go out, you cannot take them back. It's not just a newspaper or leaflet which you gives and then you can expect that probably nobody would read it. It's widely read and it goes very quickly. So we should provide with more and more alternative information. But again, for Russia, it is a problem, and because they cannot find that information in Russia itself, because they have very marginal alternative media, which, for example, their leading alternative news TV channel, Deutsch, having an audience of 0.2. I mean, this is ridiculous. You cannot change the public opinion with an outlet having that outreach. So that's why people from Russia come into Ukraine and stop fake to read what's wrong with Russian news. And now we have half of our audience, half of the million unique visitors each month are coming from Russia. They are looking and seeking information.
And sorry, if I can jump in there, I think this brings us to a key point, which I suspect applies into the ISIS situation as well, which is that once you have your narrative and once you have your storyline and once you have all the things you want to say to the other side, how do you then get the other side to listen? You know, in Russia, 94% of people get their news from TV, and the Kremlin controls all the TV stations. I would assume that in the territories which ISIS has taken over, there's not a whole lot of independent broadcasting either. So how do you then get alternative information, which is not propaganda itself, it's purely this is what's happening? How do you get that to the people who need to hear it when you have somebody on the other side who is committed to stopping that getting in? And I think that's a question for both of you.
Well, if we talk about ISIS in Iraq and in the western part of the country, I believe the federal government in Baghdad has to take some concrete steps in the national reconciliation so that we assure the Sunni community in these areas which are under the control of ISIS to have a better hope for a better future. Because if we just let them to be under the control of ISIS and for them not to see any tangible, concrete steps, then they would accept where they are. It's a two-dimensional thing. Then first we fight against ISIS in the front line in Iraq and Syria where they are. Second, fighting those who are in the pipeline who have been recruited and they will come to join them. If there is will, there is way. We can stop that because this is a military warfare. We have to do it in the battleground. This is an economic warfare. We have to drain their financial and economic resources. This is an ideological fight. And who should do the ideological fight, as the question was there? It's not the United States. It's not the West. It's not EU or NATO. It's the Islamic world and the Arab world. Therefore, you have to target it. I believe the civil society has a role to play because these people hide themselves under the banner and the umbrella of Islam in order to do this fight. Where does Islam stand on this? Therefore, they have to speak up their mind. Then it will go out. It's not leaving it to the propaganda machinery because these people have already decided to come and join ISIS. Unless they see themselves and they step back and they go back to their countries. So therefore, they also can be brought to these TV stations to talk about their experience and what they have seen so that people know the truth. The truth from somebody who has decided to leave ISIS after they were within ISIS. Therefore, it's a multidimensional, talking to the society, for the government in Baghdad, in order to show them that their future would be better off, but also using any kind of weapon in our hand, any kind of tool in the social media. For example, why should ISIS be able to use Twitter and Facebook while we all know that pornography or child pornography is forbidden? There has to be some stricter regulations on the usage of the social media for the benefit of ISIS. Or the Islamic schools, the mosques. The mosques have to be used only for prayers. After prayers, they have to be closed, not to brainwash people within mosques to join ISIS. So therefore, we have to get together and agree on a short-term and long-term plan, ideologically, economically, financially, logistically, and militarily.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Yevhen?
Yeah, my answer would be, I would continue with what I already said, that information and more information, but also probably we need to explain to people how we can define that this is a fake information. So we should, again, raise their awareness and explain. And this is a kind of weird media literacy which was spread in Soviet Union. So if Soviet newspaper was publishing that they have some big achievements in industry or agriculture, it means that the results are really very poor. When now I am reading so-called news from Russian media outlets, and they are repeating from day to day, Russia is not hurt by sanctions, Russia is not hurt by sanctions. I mean, that really means that they are very frustrated by sanctions, and sanctions really hurt. When today I read that the opinion article on RT that you can buy any Russian-looking military equipment like tanks, APCs, and assault helicopters from Czech website. So it really gives the idea that they are trying to hint us on something, that probably they are going to use assault helicopters somewhere and planes, and they already explained us that it's not us, that probably NATO or Americans bought from Czech website. So we should really explain how propaganda works. We should deconstruct it and to explain the main manipulative instruments, the first thing. The other is to delegitimize those so-called media organizations which are not media organizations. So we should explain to people that they are just exploiting the concept of media and journalism, and they're corrupting it. So we should not presume that they are journalists. And they really care about that. And another thing, probably national governments throughout Western Europe and US should more carefully look at the licensing process if these media organizations are operating in other countries, and the way of financing. Because I can give you here the example of a Russia Today America director who was just released from US jail, where he spent 1 year for tax fraud. So probably they don't have a very transparent system of financing their InfoWar operations in other countries. Or if, the last point, if you again following the seizure of Russian state property now, Russia is really very, very worried because some their so-called media outlets were also influenced by that, like RT in France and TASS and RIA abroad. And they do really care when we see the word sanctions, because what they expect that the West is weak, because the West is liberal, and they would always presume that they are sacred cow because they are journalists, that they cannot be touched, you know, they cannot be looked into their operations, so they have a free hand to do whatever they want. No, they really do care, and they are really very worried about this. I mean, as a journalist, probably I should not praise sanctions against media organizations or any other things, but again, they are not media as we, all of us, understand that.
If I may add, at the beginning when ISIS came, people thought that this is an invincible force that they cannot be defeated. Therefore, this is how they came. But when the Peshmergas were able to stop their advances and to be on the offensive and kill a large number and gain back territory, including the Mosul Dam, which was a very strategic thing, people have seen that they can be defeated. So therefore, it is not that kind of thing for us. We are in the battlefront. We show the people who they are. But another thing, when we see the media outlets showing some young men strong, wearing black suits or black uniforms and showing them strong, this is attractive. While we on our channels, we see them being killed, dirty with beard, thrown in the front line and killed. This is how ISIS should be given, because they should not be shown in an attractive way to attract other young people to join them.
Interesting point. Now, there's a gentleman down here who's been waiting terribly patiently.
Thank you so much. I'm David Fogo from the Hungarian MOD, and my question would go to Mr. Minister, and I try to be very politically correct, but if I'm not that successful, then I do apologize. Could you elaborate on the practical side of your work, please? Because from our Ukrainian expert, we heard about this website, of course, and what they're doing, and what you just mentioned is for me at least, looks pretty theoretical about the terrorism issue and who we're calling terrorists. Of course, it's a big issue, and out of the 28 countries, I'm not sure how many are agreeing in NATO, because they are using pretty different definitions for terrorism. So is there a practical side? Because your last comment was very precious for me. You just talked about the success of Peshmergas, and of course I'm very well aware of that because Hungary is sending troops to Erbil, and we're really focusing on to help with money and ammunition as well, not just troops. But anyway, so if you could show these great examples like best practices, then we probably wouldn't read in the news that many tribes, even in Africa, they're taking their oath to support ISIS. We have many different areas where they probably never heard of the Peshmergas, and that like a smaller community can successfully fight against ISIS. So this would be like a good example to show in further areas. So as a practical side, so if you could tell me about it, thank you.
Iraq, the majority of the people of Iraq are Muslims. So we have Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslim, and the Kurds are Muslims as well. Therefore, when ISIS comes and tells us that they are fighting for the sake of Islam, so what are we then? Therefore, we cannot buy in their propaganda. But the point is that they have been able to brainwash people as a result of the Arab Spring and what they have done. The problem is not in Islam. The problem is the politicization of Islam and using it as a tool for power. This is an attempt at getting power and controlling people and imposing on the people their way of life. Therefore, the Peshmergas did this fight because we have been fighting against Saddam Hussein regime. And Peshmergas are ready to sacrifice their life. And this is what the word Peshmerga means. Peshmerga means somebody who is ready to sacrifice his life for the sake of protecting others. That's why they believed in it. And they have the will to fight. But they have been able to recruit others through this misinformation and propaganda and brainwashing people that they have been oppressed, they have been treated badly, the resources have not been shared with them, therefore Islam is the solution. But what version of Islam? That's why I said it's a minority of people who are claiming to be representing Islam, while the majority of Muslims are for peace, tolerance, and peaceful coexistence. They've not been able to achieve their objective in Kurdistan because we had the will to fight. We know that we are right, and we are thankful for this support of the coalition partners, including your country. We have many who have come to help us in training, capacity building, in providing weapons and ammunition in order to continue the fight.
And if I may, I think it was a very strong question. You've made the point very clearly. One of the reasons the Peshmerga have been so successful is because they're a unified body and they believe in it. And you contrasted that with other people in other areas who've just handed over the weapons and gone. Is there some way that the Peshmerga can teach other people that sense of unity, that sense of belief? I mean, you've said the Peshmerga have this internal unity and therefore are different and harder to beat. How can you pass that on? Is that a lesson you can teach to other people?
Well, this is a difficult question because for any army, for any military force, you have to have a cause and you have to believe in that cause and you have to be ready to die for that cause. And unfortunately, when Mosul fell and Salah ad-Din and Diyala and Anbar, there was enough force. There were enough Iraqi army troops and forces that laid down their army and they did not fight. That was a collapse of the Iraqi army. They did not fight because they did not believe in it and they were not ready to die for it. Recently we have seen in Ramadi, it was a major setback. While we were preparing to retake Mosul and we were ready, we were waiting for Iraqi army to be ready so that together we liberate Mosul. The setback in Ramadi brought us back because those who were there on the ground, they did not have the will to fight. And we have to be honest. We have to admit it. The officials in Baghdad have to be honest with the Iraqi people, with the international community, and with the coalition partners. We should not put the blame on others. First, we have to blame ourselves. why we were not able to reach agreement, why we were not able to put in place the constitution that the majority of the Iraqi people voted for, why Baghdad is not ready to share the power and wealth. These are questions that have to be asked. Therefore, when people believe in their cause, they die for it. Iraqi army soldiers, they get their salary. Peshmerga does not get their salary, but the Peshmerga fight, the Iraqi army does not fight. Therefore, you have to believe in your cause. The Peshmergas believe in that. The whole community, the whole society in Kurdistan, not only Kurds, Turkmen, Assyrian, Chaldean, Yazidis, Muslims, they all support the Peshmerga because they know they fight for a noble cause.
So we had one question here. Do we have further questions? I think we're probably getting close to wrap-up time. So, any voices from the gods? No voices from the gods. Okay, so we've got the gentleman here in second row.
My name is Daniel Milo. I'm working for the Ministry of Interior of Slovak Republic, and I have a question for both panelists, and that is, do you see any changes in propaganda, both by ISIS and by the Russians, in order to strengthen and intensify recruitment efforts? Because what we are seeing here in Slovakia, especially in our ministry, is ever-increasing number of Slovaks going over to Ukraine to fight for the Russian separatists. Just recently, a couple of days ago, literally, first Czechoslovak unit was created in the separatist forces. So do you see any changes or change of how the propaganda works in order to bring more foreign fighters in those conflicts?
Well, as far as we are concerned, their brutal acts have shown the reality about them, because I don't believe any human being on earth would accept beheading of animals, let alone human beings, or burning human beings. Therefore, they have not been able, but they are using religion and Islam in order to attract people, to tell them that solution lies in Islam. But I believe we have an opportunity through the Islamic scholars, through the Islamic institutions, the Islamic madrasas, in order to educate the people and to use education to address them. They would be losing the propaganda, and they are losing, because the whole world get together. When we have an international coalition of 64 nations supporting Iraq and Kurdistan region in the fight against ISIS, it means that almost the whole world is with this cause and against ISIS. Therefore, it's doable, and they will be defeated militarily and also in terms of propaganda. But we have to get our act together. We have to have a clear strategy, a counter messaging, counter narrative, but also to take these steps politically, economically, socially, culturally, educationally, and ideologically to fight them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Propaganda becomes much more sophisticated compared to what it used to be at the very beginning, because we dealt with a very simple fakes, just which school kids can create. So you just take a photo and manipulate it and say that instead of Tiananmen Square in China, this is Donetsk. So they depicted a war where there was no war over there. They depicted the failure of Ukrainian army even before Ukrainian army existed, because when the occupation of Crimea started, Ukrainian army was non-existent. By they all the time repeated that they surrender and surrender. And so then it became at some point obvious that they really need to do something with that, because they just repeat themselves. And probably one of the kind of a climax point was a famous story with a crucified boy. I'm sure all of you heard it. So that was kind of a mixture of an old narrative from Bible and the new narrative from Game of Thrones, you know, and by the end of the day it appeared to be fake, but I'm sure that this story motivated some people in Russia to sign up and go to east of Ukraine to fight. So they really use a strong emotional narrative to persuade people to come and say that there is a huge cause, and this is, you know, local people struggling to get their independence, and they're struggling with fascists. And then when Russian non-military, I mean not regular forces, which also are fighting over there, came to eastern Ukraine, and they've been searching for fascists. And they were very disappointed. Well, all the fascists gone. They came back to Russia and say, no fascists over there. So everything was in fail, because it was very ideologically motivated move. And again, they manipulated and faked the narrative of World War II, or as they call it, Great Patriotic War, to build this narrative train to the contemporary fascists in Ukraine. And in a wild imagination of people, of course, that was a great uprising of people against the junta in Kiev. So they subscribed. And probably that's what happened to mercenaries from other countries. So it means one simple thing, that they don't have enough people from Russia who now are willing to go to fight over there. So they need to hire among people in other countries. And the story with 2 officers from Russian Spetsnaz who've been caught is very evident, because the Russian Ministry of Defense said they are not with us, we don't know them. So basically they left them over there. And believe me, in military circles, it's more than demotivating factor to struggle for any cause. So now they really need to look out for people anywhere else.
Thank you. We're on the last couple of minutes, in fact, so unless we have any burning questions, and I hope we don't have burning questions because we're in a small theatre and we don't want to burn it down. But I thought I would wrap up this discussion both by thanking our panelists who've done a great job, and also by asking the final question, which is, we've talked about info warfare, we've talked about the things which need doing. Whose job is it to do it? Is the final question. Who has to do this? Start with the Minister.
Well, I believe we have to do it at different levels. Governments have their share, civil society have their share. In our case, the Islamic countries have it, and the media has it. Because if we look at ISIS, they are using the social media. They don't have broadcasting corporations, but the social media is their tool, and also locally when they're broadcasting for the local people under their control. But those who are in their areas do not support them necessarily. Therefore, we have to make a distinction in the western part of Iraq. Not necessarily everybody living in that part of Iraq is supportive of ISIS. The problem is that ISIS is being perceived as a terrorist organization, but it's a terrorist organization that they claimed a state. They established a state, not recognizing the borders between Iraq and Syria. They have territory, they have population under their control, and they have resources. Therefore, we should not see them as a small terrorist group. It's a big terrorist organization with the capabilities of state, having captured weapons from Iraqi army and Syrian army, and have got weapons from elsewhere. Therefore, we have to do it, and we have to realize that it's a collective responsibility of different outlets in order to counter them.
Thank you. And Yevhen?
Yeah, from my perspective, government should not be doing this for one simple reason, the reason of credibility. Because if we talk about, for example, Russian war against Ukraine, if Ukrainian government starts producing any counter efforts, we can call it counter propaganda, whatever, so that would not have any credibility, because people would say, well, this is one propaganda versus other propaganda, why I should trust? Why audience in Russia would come to their website to read the news if they already have enough of Russian government propaganda, you know? So this is a question of distrust. So government, that's why what Stop Fake is doing is so successful, and what Ukrainian Ministry of Information probably would be very unsuccessful in doing if they would even start doing that. Another question is if journalists should be doing that, because this war, which took already almost 7,000 people dead and more than 1 million displaced people, was caused by activities of so-called journalists. So again, that's a huge question of credibility and trust. And basically we can say that the notion of the concept of a journalist is totally ruined, and it should be rebuilt. So probably the civic society should, you know, come in and fill in this gap and provide as more information as possible to fill this vacuum of real information. Because I would agree that most people live in parallel reality if we talk about, for example, Russian audience. So the need is to drag them from there and to return to the very critical way of thinking about the reality, to rethink these events. And so probably if they do not trust government and they do not trust journalists, so civic society representatives should start cooperating. And for example, Stop Fake is dealing a lot with Russian alternative media, websites and organizations which are not establishment media, but where we can find a lot of people who think in pretty much the same way.
In fact, in our case, it's different because we as a government, we are responsible. It's the Peshmerga forces who belong to our government who are in the front line. We have the responsibility to inform our people what's happening. And that's why we disclose the number of people, the Peshmergas who have been martyred, the number of Peshmergas who have been wounded. This is our job as a government. We have to be transparent and open and to tell the people what we have done. But also we have people, individuals, civil society who are fighting the counter-narrative on behalf of the people of Kurdistan. Therefore, as a government, there is room and responsibility for the governments to play their role in informing the people what the government has been doing, what government forces have been doing. So therefore, it's not only a propaganda machinery, but it's information.
So thank you both very much. So I guess in conclusion, we say that dealing with misinformation is everybody's job. So the government officials here do need to worry about it. You can't just take the weekend off. And all the rest of us need to worry about it as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much to both our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.